Hooligan attacked Royal Guard's horse. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Whitcroft guided his mount Apollo through their morning patrol. The magnificent black stallion, specially trained for aim, the King's Life Guard, moved with practiced precision, each step a testament to years of careful training. But before we jump back into the video, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're enjoying this story, don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow I've got something really special for you. And now, back to the video. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace as Sergeant James Whitcroft guided his mount, Apollo, through their morning patrol. The magnificent black stallion, specially trained for the King's Life Guard, moved with practiced precision, each step a testament to years of careful training. At 17 hands high, Apollo cut an imposing figure, his coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the early light. His ceremonial tack sparkled with brass fittings that matched Whitcroft's immaculate uniform. Together, they embodied centuries of tradition, a living symbol of dignity and service. Whitcroft, a decorated veteran with 15 years of service, including tours in Afghanistan, sat perfectly positioned in the saddle. His scarlet tunic and bearskin cap drew the usual tourist attention, cameras clicking as visitors gathered to watch the mounted patrol. The peaceful routine of the morning patrol was about to be shattered. Among the gathering crowd, a group of rowdy football supporters had spilled out from a nearby pub, their boisterous behavior standing out sharply against the respectful atmosphere of the palace grounds. Their team had lost badly, and the morning's drinking had done nothing to improve their mood. One man in particular caught Whitcroft's trained eye. Mark Thorne, though the guard didn't know his name yet, swayed noticeably as he pushed through the crowd. His team's jersey was stained with spilled beer, and his face was flushed with a dangerous combination of alcohol and wounded pride. "Oi, look at this." Thorne's voice carried across the courtyard, sharp with mock amazement. "They've got the horses playing dress-up too." His friends laughed, encouraging his increasingly aggressive behavior. Whitcroft maintained his forward gaze, his posture perfect as decades of training had ingrained. But beneath his ceremonial calm, his combat-honed instincts were alerting him to the building tension. Apollo's ears twitched slightly, picking up on his rider's subtle shift in awareness. The crowd began to part around Thorne as he stumbled closer, tourist families pulling their children back while continuing to record on their phones. A palace security officer had noticed the commotion and was speaking quietly into his radio, but he was still too far away to intervene immediately. "What's wrong, soldier boy?" Thorne called out, his words slurring slightly. "Too posh to acknowledge. Us common folk." He spread his arms wide, playing to his audience of friends who had formed a loose semicircle behind him. "Or maybe it's the horse that thinks it's too good for us." An elderly man wearing a veteran's pin stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "Son, that's a King's Life Guard. Show some respect." Thorne's head snapped toward the veteran, his face darkening. "Respect? For what? Some bloke sitting up there thinking he's better than us because of his fancy hat and his oversized pony." Whitcroft remained motionless, but his mind was already calculating potential scenarios. Years of military service had taught him to read situations, to anticipate threats before they fully developed. He could feel Apollo's muscles tensing slightly beneath him, the highly trained mount picking up on the building tension. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays catching the brass buttons of Whitcroft's uniform and the polished leather of Apollo's tack. The usual tourist chatter had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence as more people noticed the confrontation unfolding. A young mother hurriedly guided her children toward the palace gates, whispering something about coming back later. Other tourists had backed away, forming a wider circle around Thorne and his friends, their phones still recording but their expressions showing increasing concern. "I said I'm talking to you." Thorne took another stumbling step forward, now close enough that Whitcroft could smell the beer on his breath. "Or do we need to get your horse's attention instead?" The threat in his voice was unmistakable, causing several onlookers to gasp. The security officer had begun moving more quickly through the crowd, but he was still moments away from reaching the scene. Whitcroft maintained his position, his eyes fixed forward, but every sense was alert. Apollo stood perfectly still, his training evident in every line of his powerful frame. The morning air seemed to crackle with tension as Thorn's next move hung in the balance. Thorn's friends had spread out in a loose semicircle, their phones raised to capture what they thought would be entertaining content for their social media. None of them seemed to notice how the palace security officers were quietly coordinating their response, or how other members of the mounted patrol had begun to adjust their positions. "Look at this horse," Thorn announced, his voice carrying the dangerous edge of wounded pride mixed with too much alcohol. "Bet it's never seen a real fight in its life, all dressed up like it's going to a fancy party." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a half-eaten meat pie from the pub. "Bet it's only fed the finest hay, isn't it? Too good for proper food." The security officer was now close enough to call out a warning. "Sir, step away from the horse, this is your only notice." But Thorn was too far gone, too invested in his performance. He squeezed the pie in his fist, letting greasy crumbs fall to the cobblestones. "What's wrong? Afraid your precious horse might actually show some spirit?" Apollo's ears flicked slightly at the commotion, but the stallion remained perfectly still, his training evident in every line of his powerful frame. Whitcroft maintained his forward gaze, though his hands had imperceptibly adjusted their grip on the reins, ready for whatever might come next. "You know what I think?" Thorn stepped closer, weaving slightly. "I think this whole thing is just for show. The horse, the soldier, all of it. Just fancy dress up to impress the tourists." He raised the pie, clearly intending to throw it. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. Parents pulled their children back further, while several veterans in the crowd exchanged knowing looks. They recognized the calm before the storm, the moment when protocol would meet necessity. "Last warning," the security officer called out, now only yards away. "Stand down or you will be arrested." Thorn's response was to laugh, harsh and mocking. "Arrest me for what? Offering a snack to Her Majesty's pony?" He drew his arm back, the pie dripping grease onto his team jersey. "Come on, horsey, show us what you're really made of." The pie flew through the air, but what happened next would leave the crowd gasping. Apollo, responding to the subtlest of cues from his rider, sidestepped with balletic grace. The pie sailed harmlessly past, splattering against the cobblestones. Not a single speck had touched the horse's gleaming coat or the guard's immaculate uniform. Thorn's face contorted with rage at his failed attempt. "Oh, so you can move when you want to." He started forward, his intentions clearly hostile. "Let's see how well you dance when—" His words cut off as he stumbled on the uneven cobblestones, his alcohol-impaired balance failing him. As he pitched forward, his hand shot out, grasping for anything to break his fall. His fingers found Apollo's ceremonial breastplate. The contact lasted only a second, but it was enough. The carefully polished brass piece, a symbol of centuries of tradition, was smeared with pie grease and beer stains. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as Thorn caught himself, a triumphant sneer spreading across his face. "Not so perfect now, are you?" he taunted, apparently emboldened by finally making contact. His friends had drawn closer, their phones still recording, but their expressions showing the first signs of uncertainty. This had gone beyond a simple prank. Whitcroft remained motionless, but something had changed in his bearing. Though his posture was as correct as ever, there was now a palpable sense of contained power in his stillness. Those in the crowd who had served recognized it immediately. This wasn't ceremonial discipline anymore, but rather the coiled readiness of a combat veteran. Apollo stood steady, but his muscles had tensed beneath the saddle. The stallion's training warred with natural instinct, creating a tableau of perfectly controlled power. The morning sun caught the smeared breastplate, the marred brass a stark testament to the line that had just been crossed. Thorn, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere, reached out again. "What's wrong, soldier boy? Afraid to show us what you're—" "Really?" His words died in his throat as Apollo's head turned slightly, fixing him with one dark eye. In that gaze was something Thorn had never expected to see. Not mindless aggression or fear, but the same disciplined power that radiated from his rider. This wasn't a mere ceremonial mount. This was a highly trained military animal, and Thorn had just made a serious miscalculation. The next few moments unfolded with military precision. Whitcroft's right hand moved a fraction of an inch on the reins, a signal invisible to civilian observers, but crystal clear to his mount. Apollo responded instantly, his powerful body pivoting, with parade ground precision to face Thorn directly. The drunk man stumbled backward, suddenly confronted with the full presence of the military mount. Apollo stood 17 hands high, his muscled chest now squarely facing the aggressor, his eye bearing transforming from ceremonial to commanding in a heartbeat. "Bloody hell," one of Thorne's friends muttered, lowering his phone. "Mark, maybe we should—" But Thorne wasn't finished. The alcohol in his system had overwhelmed whatever survival instincts might have warned him to back down. He balled his fists, swaying slightly as he tried to maintain his bravado. "Oh, now you want to face me?" he sneered, though his voice had lost some of its certainty. "Come on then, show us what you—" His words cut off as Whitcroft's left hand moved. Another subtle command that had Apollo taking one measured step forward. The horse's hooves struck the cobblestones with deliberate force, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent courtyard. Thorne stumbled back again, his fake courage crumbling as he realized just how massive Apollo was up close. The stallion's shoulders were level with his chest, and those hooves that had just struck the cobblestones were the size of dinner plates. "Mark," another of his friends called out urgently. "Let's go, mate. This isn't—" But it was too late. Thorne, desperately trying to save face, reached out to shove Apollo's shoulder. "Get back, you oversized." What happened next would be viewed millions of times on social media, though no video could fully capture the precision of it. As Thorne's hand made contact with Apollo's shoulder, Whitcroft's body shifted a fraction of an inch in the saddle. The horse responded instantly, executing a perfect half-turn that swept Thorne's feet from under him with the gentlest brush of a muscled flank. Thorne hit the cobblestones with a grunt, his remaining pie squashing beneath him. He lay there, covered in his own mess, staring up at the horse and rider who now towered over him like living statues. The security officers had reached them now, but they paused, recognizing that Whitcroft had the situation well in hand. The guard hadn't moved from his ceremonial position, hadn't broken protocol, yet he had completely controlled the situation. "On your feet," one of the officers finally ordered Thorne. "You're under arrest for attempting to assault a member of the King's Lifeguard and their mount." Thorne tried to scramble up, but the combination of alcohol, greasy cobblestones, and his own pie made it a graceless effort. "You can't arrest me," he protested, his words slurring. "I was just having a—" "Laugh! The horse attacked me!" A veteran in the crowd stepped forward, his voice carrying clear authority. "That horse just demonstrated more discipline than you've shown in your entire life, young man. If he'd wanted to attack you, you'd be in hospital now, not just wearing your pie." The crowd had begun to murmur, their phones still recording as the police arrived to support the security officers. Parents were using the moment to teach their children about respect and consequences, while several military veterans nodded approvingly at Whitcroft's handling of the situation. Thorne's friends had backed away, trying to distance themselves from the scene. Their phones had disappeared, their earlier enthusiasm for recording the confrontation replaced by shame at their part in it. As Thorne was helped to his feet by the officers, Apollo remained perfectly still, his dark eyes watching the proceedings with intelligent awareness. The morning sun caught his tack, making the brass fittings gleam despite the smear on his breastplate. A small imperfection that somehow highlighted the perfect discipline of horse and rider. A young girl in the crowd tugged at her father's sleeve. "Daddy, why did the bad man try to hurt the horse?" The father, a retired military man, judging by his bearing, knelt beside her. "He didn't understand, sweetheart. That's not just any horse, that's a soldier too, just like his rider. They protect us, and they deserve our respect." Whitcroft maintained his forward gaze as the police began taking statements from witnesses. His posture remained perfect, his discipline unbroken, but there was something more visible now. An aura of quiet authority that had nothing to do with ceremony and everything to do with the real military capability that lay beneath the ceremonial surface. The police investigation unfolded with methodical efficiency. Officers collected witness statements while palace security maintained a perimeter around the scene. Through it all, Whitcroft and Apollo remained at their post, their discipline unbroken, despite being the center of attention. "Multiple videos of the incident, sir," a young officer reported to his superior, scrolling through his phone. "Already going viral. The public response is—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Overwhelmingly supportive of the guard and his mount." Indeed, social media was exploding with clips of the incident. perfect response to drunk idiot, and Royal Guard horse show's ultimate class were trending. The videos captured everything: Thorne's aggressive approach, the guard's unwavering discipline, and Apollo's precise response. A senior palace official had arrived, his expression grave as he surveyed the scene. His eyes lingered on the smeared breastplate, the only visible evidence of Thorne's assault. "That's a ceremonial piece," he explained to the police inspector. "Handcrafted, centuries of tradition. The disrespect shown here goes beyond simple vandalism." Thorne, now sitting in the back of a police car, had begun to sober up. The reality of his situation was finally penetrating the alcohol-induced haze. His friends had disappeared, leaving him to face the consequences alone. Through the window, he watched as photographers from major news outlets arrived, drawn by the viral social media storm. "I didn't mean," he started, but the words died in his throat as he caught sight of his reflection in the car window. His team jersey was covered in pie filling, his face smeared with dirt from the cobblestones. The image of dignity and discipline displayed by horse and rider only highlighted his own disgraceful behavior. A distinguished-looking man in a suit approached the police inspector, presenting credentials that caused the officer to straighten immediately. "Royal Veterinary Corps," he announced, moving toward Apollo. "Standard procedure after any incident involving the lifeguard mounts." The veterinarian's examination was brief, but thorough. Apollo stood perfectly still, allowing the checkup with the same discipline he showed on parade. "Remarkable," the vet muttered, running expert hands over the horse's shoulders. "Not even elevated vitals. The training these animals undergo. It's beyond exceptional." Tourists had begun gathering again, maintaining a respectful distance as they watched the proceedings. Parents lifted children onto their shoulders, pointing out how straight the guard sat, how still the horse stood. The scene had become an impromptu lesson in dignity and restraint. "The ceremonial tack will need to be fully restored," the palace official was saying, photographing the damage. "These pieces are part of our national heritage. The cost of restoration will be added to the charges." A woman pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm his sister," she announced to the police. "I saw it on Twitter. I can't believe he—" She stopped, looking at the magnificent horse and his motionless rider. "I'm so sorry. Our father was military. He'd be mortified." The police inspector nodded sympathetically, but remained professional. "Your brother is facing serious charges. Assault on a member of the King's Lifeguard, damage to ceremonial military equipment, public intoxication, disturbing the peace." A small boy had broken away from his parents, approaching the scene with wide-eyed wonder. Instead of fear at the earlier confrontation, his face showed only admiration. He stopped at a respectful distance, raised his small hand, and executed a salute that, while imperfect, carried genuine respect. The crowd fell silent, watching. For a brief moment, Whitcroft's eyes shifted, meeting the child's gaze. His white-gloved hand moved in a precise return salute, acknowledging the boy's gesture. With formal military courtesy, the moment lasted only seconds, but cameras caught it, capturing the perfect contrast between mindless aggression and disciplined respect. From the police car, Thorne watched the interaction, shame finally replacing his earlier bravado. The alcohol was wearing off, leaving him with the cold reality of his actions. He'd attacked not just a horse or a guard, but centuries of tradition, discipline, and service. 3 weeks later, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Mark Thorne emerged from his sentencing hearing. His sister stood beside him, her face stern as cameras flashed. Gone was his team jersey, replaced by a somber suit that seemed to weigh heavily on his shoulders. "Mr. Thorne," a reporter called out, "any comment on the judge's decision?" Thorne stopped, facing the media for the first time since the incident. The past weeks had changed him. The viral videos of his behavior had cost him his job, his reputation, and now his freedom, at least partially. "What I did was inexcusable," he began, his voice carrying none of the bravado from that morning. "I disrespected not just a guard and his mount, but centuries of tradition and service." He paused, swallowing hard. "The sentence is fair." The judge had been unequivocal. 6 months suspended sentence, significant fines including the full cost of restoring the ceremonial tack, 200 hours of community service to be served at the Royal Mews, and a lifetime ban from approaching within 100 meters of any mounted guard unit. Back at Buckingham Palace, Sergeant Whitcroft and Apollo continued their duties. The breastplate had been restored to its former glory, the brass gleaming in the sunlight. If anything, the incident had only enhanced their reputation. Tourists now watched the mounted patrols with increased respect, parents teaching children about the true meaning of discipline and service. The Royal Veterinary Corps had written a commendation for Apollo's behavior during the incident. Exemplary restraint and response to commands under provocative conditions, the report noted. A testament to the breeding and training program of the King's Lifeguard mounts. In the Royal Mews stables, where Thorne now reported for his community service, the Master of Horse had made things very clear. "You'll learn every aspect of caring for these animals," he declared. "Maybe then you'll understand what you really attacked that day." Every morning, Thorne cleaned stalls, polished tack, and learned about the incredible partnership between the guards and their mounts. He watched the hours of preparation that went into each ceremonial duty, the meticulous attention to detail, the unwavering dedication to tradition. The other stable hands had been skeptical at first, but as weeks passed, they noticed a change. Thorne worked silently, diligently, his previous arrogance replaced by genuine humility. He'd flinch when videos of his actions appeared on phones or TV screens, unable to recognize the person he'd been that morning. One Saturday, as he polished brass fittings under supervision, a familiar sound made him look up. Apollo and Whitcroft were returning from a morning patrol. The stallion's hooves struck the cobblestones with the same precise rhythm that had once filled Thorne with drunken rage. Now he felt only shame. As horse and rider passed, Thorne stood back, head bowed in respect. Apollo's dark eye caught his for a moment, intelligent and aware. There was no malice in that gaze, no grudge held. The horse's dignity only emphasized the lesson Thorne had learned at such cost. "They're a special breed," the stablemaster commented, watching Thorne's reaction. "Both of them, the guards and their mounts, takes years to build that bond, that level of trust and discipline. Can't be faked, can't be bought, has to be earned." Later that evening, as Thorne walked home from his duties, he passed a newspaper stand. The incident had made the headlines again. Royal Guard incident changes policy on public behavior. The article detailed new guidelines for tourist conduct around mounted units, using his case as an example of consequences. His sister was waiting at home, and for the first time since the incident, she saw real change in her brother's eyes. "I get it now," he told her quietly. "What Dad used to say about respect, about tradition. Those aren't just horses and guards up there. They're everything we're supposed to aspire to be." At Buckingham Palace, as the sun set on another day of duty, Sergeant Whitcroft led Apollo back to the Royal Mews. Their brass fittings gleamed, their bearing perfect as ever. They passed tourists who now stood back respectfully, children who saluted properly, and veterans who nodded in quiet acknowledgement. The incident had become more than just another viral video. It had reminded people that beneath the ceremonial surface, real soldiers and their mounts stood guard, their discipline and dedication an unbroken line stretching back through centuries of service. And in a small flat across London, a humbled man watched the evening news, finally understanding the true weight of what he challenged that drunken morning.